For decades, this story remained silent. It did not appear in official reports. It was not discussed in victory speeches or carved into stone monuments. While the world celebrated an ending, something else was carefully pushed aside, buried beneath relief, reconstruction, and the urgent desire to move forward. When the war ended, people believed the suffering had ended with it. They were wrong. In the final days, as weapons fell quiet and borders stopped shifting, countless lives stood at a fragile threshold. Survival was mistaken for salvation. Return was confused with restoration. Yet for many, the true cost of the war had only begun to reveal itself. They came back to familiar streets that felt foreign, to homes that no longer felt safe, to faces that smiled but did not understand what had been carried through fire, loss, and silence. The world wanted closure. These survivors carried something that refused to close. What happened after the war did not fit into neat conclusions. It was uncomfortable. It challenged the idea that endings are clean, that peace immediately heals what violence has broken. And so, quietly, this story was set aside. Not because it lacked importance, but because it revealed something deeply unsettling. It revealed that the war did not end when the fighting stopped. Behind the parades and declarations, there were lives unraveling in slow, invisible ways. Men and women who had endured the unimaginable now faced a different kind of battle, one without uniforms, without commands, and without recognition. This is not a story about how the war was fought. It is a story about what happened when it was over, and why, for so many, the end of the war marked the beginning of something far more difficult to survive. The moment the war officially ended was marked by celebration, but celebration did not reach everyone equally. In cities spared from destruction, people filled streets with relief. In places already broken, silence settled like dust. For those who had survived the war itself, the sudden absence of danger felt less like freedom and more like exposure. They returned carrying memories that had no place to rest. There were no words prepared for what they had seen, no rituals designed to absorb experiences that defied explanation. The war had trained them to endure, to obey, to react. Peace demanded something else entirely, something no one had taught them how to give. Homes waited, but they were not the same homes left behind. Walls still stood, yet the life within them had shifted. Familiar routines felt distant, almost artificial. Loved ones expected recognition, gratitude, reunion. What they encountered instead were pauses, silences, eyes that searched for exits, even in safety. For civilians, the end of the war removed the structure that suffering had imposed. During conflict, pain had direction. There was an enemy, a reason, a future imagined beyond the noise. When the fighting stopped, grief lost its shape. Losses that had been postponed now demanded attention. Names unspoken during the war resurfaced. Absences became permanent. Entire communities discovered that peace did not erase hunger, fear, or uncertainty. It only changed their source. Rations did not disappear overnight. Homes did not rebuild themselves. Trust, once broken, did not return on command. The war had reordered values, teaching people what mattered when survival was uncertain. Peace asked them to forget those lessons without offering replacements. What made this transition especially cruel was the expectation of gratitude. Survivors were told they were lucky, that they should be thankful it was over, and they were. But gratitude did not cancel exhaustion. It did not undo what had been witnessed or what had been lost. Many learned quickly that speaking honestly about this tension made others uncomfortable, so they adjusted. They learned to nod when praised for resilience. They learned to smile when asked if everything was fine. They learned that the easiest way to move forward was to say nothing at all. And in that silence, the true aftermath of the war began to take shape. As months passed, the distance between what survivors felt and what the world expected grew wider. Officially, the war belonged to the past. Governments spoke of rebuilding. Newspapers printed hopeful headlines. The future was described as something waiting patiently to be claimed. But for those who had lived through the destruction, the past did not release its grip so easily. Many discovered that memory was not confined to thought. It lived in the body. Sudden noises caused involuntary reactions. Crowded rooms triggered a sense of threat. Sleep, once stolen by fear, now brought dreams that felt more real than waking life. There were moments when the war returned without warning, not as history, but as sensation. Families struggled to understand what had changed. They welcomed survivors home, believing love would be enough. But love could not translate experiences that had no civilian language. Conversations stalled. Affection felt distant. The people who returned were present, yet somehow unreachable. They had crossed a boundary few others had seen, and there was no clear path back. Civilians carried their own invisible scars. Years of loss had trained them to expect absence. Even in peace, they waited for bad news. They measured joy carefully, as if too much of it might invite punishment. The war had taught restraint, and peace offered no immediate permission to abandon it. What united all of them was a quiet realization. The world had moved on faster than they could. The war had demanded everything from them, but once it ended, it asked for nothing more. There were no instructions for how to live afterward. No recognition for the battles that continued in silence. And so, this part of the story faded from public view. It did not fit the narrative of triumph or recovery. It complicated the idea of victory. Remembering it required admitting that some wounds do not heal simply because the fighting stops. If this story resonates with you, if you believe these human experiences deserve to be remembered and understood, take a moment to support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. Keeping these stories alive ensures they are not lost beneath simplified versions of history. The war had ended on paper, but for those who survived it, something else had only just begun. In the years that followed, life continued outwardly as expected. Work resumed, families grew. New routines formed where chaos once ruled. To an observer, it might have appeared that the world had healed itself through persistence alone. But beneath these visible signs of normality, the war remained deeply embedded in daily existence. Survivors learned how to function without ever feeling whole. They mastered the art of appearing unaffected. Pain was managed quietly, folded into habit and discipline. What could not be spoken was carried internally, protected by silence that felt safer than exposure. In public, they were examples of endurance. In private, they were still negotiating with memory. Relationships bore the strain of unshared experience. Many marriages endured without intimacy. Friendships drifted apart under the weight of things left unsaid. The war had rearranged priorities, altering how trust was given and how closeness was measured. Emotional distance became a form of control in a world that had once proven uncontrollable. For the next generation, the war existed as atmosphere rather than event. Children sensed its presence in unspoken rules and sudden moods. They learned which questions not to ask. They inherited caution without context, discipline without explanation. The past shaped them indirectly, quietly, through behaviors that had once been necessary for survival. Society preferred not to examine this inheritance too closely. Progress depended on optimism. Dwelling on unresolved pain threatened the forward momentum of reconstruction. The war was commemorated through ceremonies and monuments, while its lingering effects were left largely unaddressed. And yet, time did not erase what had been lived. It only made it easier to overlook. The story of what happened after the war slowly disappeared from collective attention, replaced by cleaner narratives that offered comfort rather than truth. But beneath those narratives, the war continued to influence choices, fears, and silences. Its echoes were faint, but persistent. What had been buried was not the war itself, but its most human consequences. For some, the weight of what was carried could not remain hidden forever. Time, instead of softening the memory of war, sharpened it. As years passed, the contrast between what life was supposed to be and what it felt like grew more painful. The routines of peace exposed wounds that survival had once kept numb. There were moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. A smell, sound, a fragment of a song. These small details unlocked entire scenes long thought contained. The war returned not as reflection, but as presence. It demanded attention without warning, pulling survivors back into moments they had never truly left. Others experienced the war through absence. Friends who never returned, family members whose names were spoken less each year, entire futures that vanished without explanation. Peace forced them to confront the permanence of these losses. There was no enemy to blame anymore, no mission to justify the cost. Only the knowledge that what had been taken would not be restored. Some tried to speak about it, believing time had made listening easier. Often they were met with discomfort. The world preferred stories of heroism and resolution. There was little patience for ambiguity, for suffering that could not be neatly framed. Slowly, many learned that silence was still the most acceptable response. This silence passed from person to person, became part of everyday life. It shaped how people understood strength. Endurance was praised. Vulnerability was discouraged. The war had ended, but its emotional rules remained. As you listen to these experiences, consider this. How many stories like this were never told at all, simply because no one was ready to hear them? How many lives carried the war quietly, long after the world decided it was over? Not all consequences of the war were visible, and that invisibility made them easier to dismiss. There were no uniforms to mark suffering anymore, no medals for endurance and silence. Pain that lingered without physical proof was often misunderstood or ignored. Many were expected to adapt quickly, to resume productivity, to fulfill roles that no longer fit who they had become. Communities rebuilt their structures faster than they rebuilt their understanding. Institutions focused on order and efficiency. Emotional repair was considered a private matter, not a collective responsibility. Those who struggled learned to do so alone, navigating a world that had little patience for wounds it could not see. For some, the war altered their relationship with meaning itself. Beliefs that once offered comfort felt hollow after witnessing indiscriminate loss. Faith, trust in authority, and confidence in progress had all been tested and, in many cases, broken. Peace did not automatically restore what violence had shattered. Yet life continued to demand participation. People married, worked, and raised children while carrying unresolved questions about survival and fairness. Why they lived while others did not. Why suffering was distributed without logic. These questions rarely found answers, but they shaped choices in quiet, enduring ways. Over time, the line between the war and its aftermath blurred. What had once been memory became identity. Survival was no longer an event, but a state of being. The war lived on through habits of restraint, vigilance, and emotional distance. This legacy did not end with those who experienced the conflict directly. It extended outward, influencing families and communities for decades. The story buried after the war was not confined to a single generation. It became a silent inheritance. As the years turned into decades, the war receded further into history, becoming something taught in classrooms rather than remembered in bodies. Dates replaced faces, strategies replaced emotions. The scale of destruction was measured in numbers, not in the quiet moments when someone paused mid-sentence, lost in a memory they could not explain. For those who lived through it, this transformation was unsettling. Their reality was slowly rewritten by distance. What they had endured was simplified, polished, and reframed to fit lessons that could be easily understood and safely concluded. The complexity of survival, the moral uncertainty, the lingering fear, all of it faded from the public story. Many survivors noticed that with each passing year, fewer people asked what happened after the war. Curiosity focused on how it was fought, not on how it was lived afterward. The silence that once protected them now threatened to erase them. Their experiences risked becoming irrelevant, dismissed as personal weakness rather than historical consequence. Some tried again to speak, not for themselves, but for those who never had the chance. They spoke of nights without sleep, of relationships strained beyond repair, of a peace that felt fragile and conditional. Their words were careful, measured, shaped by years of restraint. Even then, they sensed that understanding remained partial. The war had taught them that survival did not guarantee clarity. It did not promise relief. It only allowed life to continue, carrying forward everything that had not been resolved. This truth conflicted with the comforting idea that history moves cleanly from conflict to peace. As listeners today, removed by time and circumstance, we face a quiet responsibility to ask not only how wars begin and end, but what they leave behind in human lives. To recognize that the most enduring damage is often the least visible. When you think about the wars you have learned about, how often have you considered the lives lived long after the final ceasefire and the stories that were never fully told? With time, many survivors learned to live alongside what could not be undone. They found ways to build meaning without resolution, to accept that some answers would never arrive. This acceptance was not peace, but it allowed life to continue with a fragile balance. The war remained present, yet it no longer demanded constant attention. In quiet moments, some reflected on how deeply the conflict had shaped who they became. Decisions made under fear had hardened instincts. Loss had redefined attachment. Joy, when it appeared, was treated carefully as something valuable but temporary. The war had altered not only what they remembered, but how they felt allowed to feel. Communities, too, carried this transformation. Entire generations grew up sensing restraint without understanding its origin. They inherited habits of caution, emotional distance, and preparedness. These traits were rarely explained. They were simply absorbed, passed down through behavior rather than words. What remained largely unacknowledged was how ordinary people adapted to extraordinary circumstances, and how those adaptations persisted long after they were needed. The war had forced humanity into survival mode. Peace never fully taught it how to return. As public memory shifted toward commemoration and ceremony, the quieter truths stayed hidden. They survived in private conversations, in glances exchanged between those who recognized each other without speaking. The story endured not in textbooks, but in lived experience. This buried history reminds us that the consequences of war do not obey timelines. They move slowly, shaping lives long after the moment that history marks as an ending. As the last witnesses of the war entered old age, a quiet urgency emerged. Time was no longer an abstract idea. It was present in slower steps, in fading voices, in memories that risked disappearing, not because they were unimportant, but because there would soon be no one left to carry them. What had once been buried by choice now faced the possibility of being lost by time. Some survivors looked back with clarity rather than pain, not because the wounds had vanished, but because they had learned to live with them. They understood that the war had taken more than lives and cities. It had taken innocence, certainty, and the belief that suffering always has meaning. These losses were harder to measure, but no less real. The world they observed around them felt distant from the one they had known. New generations spoke of war with abstraction, often unaware of how deeply it reshaped those who survived it. The silence that once protected survivors now felt heavy with regret. Not regret for surviving, but for how much had gone unspoken. Remembering became an act of responsibility rather than pain. To speak was no longer about reopening wounds, but about preventing forgetting. The buried story was not meant to inspire fear or admiration, but understanding. It was meant to remind us that war does not end cleanly, and that peace does not automatically restore what was taken. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, How many lives around you carry histories you may never fully see, shaped by events that officially ended long before you were born? If these stories matter to you, if you believe history should include not only how wars are fought, but how they are survived, support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. Preserving these human truths depends on those willing to listen. When history declares that a war has ended, it draws a line that feels firm and final. Dates are recorded. Treaties are signed. Pages are turned. Yet for those who lived through it, that line was never so clear. The war did not stop at borders or ceasefires, settled quietly into lives, shaping them long after the noise had faded. This story was buried, not because it lacked importance, but because it challenged comfort. It asked us to accept that survival is not the same as healing, and that peace does not automatically repair what violence has broken. It reminded us that the deepest consequences of war are often carried silently, woven into everyday existence, passed from one generation to the next. To remember, this is not to dwell on suffering, but to honor truth. It is to acknowledge that history is not only made of decisions and battles, but of ordinary people adapting to loss, uncertainty, and change. Their endurance was not loud or celebrated. It was patient, quiet, and profoundly human. By bringing these stories into the light, we resist forgetting what war truly costs. Not only in lives lost, but in lives altered forever. The end of a war is not an ending for everyone. For many, it is the beginning of a lifelong process of living with what cannot be undone. And perhaps that is the lesson this buried story offers us now. That understanding the past requires listening beyond the moment of victory. That compassion begins where simple narratives end. And that remembering, even when it is uncomfortable, is an act of respect. History does not only ask us to remember what happened, it asks us to remember what remained.